Some experiments in history were so disturbing that scientists later tried to hide them forever. Real scientists once pushed human bodies and minds far beyond what should ever be allowed. Some victims believed they were receiving medical help, but they were secretly part of horrifying experiments. Others were trapped in laboratories where no one outside knew what was really happening. These experiments were conducted by governments, universities, and some of the most respected scientists in history. Many of these experiments ignored basic human rights in the name of scientific discovery. Some researchers wanted to understand pain, fear, and survival under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Others believed the knowledge gained would help win wars or control the human mind. But the results of these experiments often caused suffering far beyond what anyone expected. Many of these stories were hidden from the public for decades before the truth finally emerged. When the world finally learned what had happened, people were shocked and outraged. Some of these experiments changed the way modern science approaches ethics forever. Others remain controversial, raising questions about how far science should ever go. Today we are going to explore some of the most terrifying experiments ever conducted in human history. And some of these stories are so disturbing that many people still struggle to believe they really happened. One of the most disturbing medical experiments in history began in the United States in 1932. The study took place in a small rural town called Tuskegee, located in the state of Alabama. Researchers arrived offering what sounded like free medical care to poor local residents. More than 600 men agreed to participate because they believed doctors would help them. But the participants had no idea they were actually part of a secret medical experiment. The men believed they were receiving treatment, but the doctors never intended to cure them. Instead, scientists wanted to observe what would happen if the disease was never treated. The illness they were studying was syphilis, a dangerous infection that slowly damages the body. Doctors already knew this disease could cause blindness, paralysis, severe pain, and eventually death. But researchers were curious about exactly how the disease progressed inside the human body. That meant the patients would never receive the medicine that could actually save them. Even worse, the participants were never told the real purpose of the study. Doctors told them they were suffering from something vague called bad blood. The men trusted the doctors and returned regularly for medical examinations. Meanwhile, researchers carefully documented every symptom as the disease slowly progressed. As the years passed, many of the men became increasingly sick. Some began to lose their eyesight, while others suffered severe nerve damage. But despite the suffering, the researchers continued the experiment. Then in the 1940s, scientists discovered a powerful treatment for syphilis. The medicine was penicillin, and it could cure the infection completely. But the men in the Tuskegee study were never given this life-saving treatment. Researchers decided continuing the experiment was more important than saving the patients. For decades, the study continued quietly without the public knowing the truth. Many participants never realized they had been part of a dangerous experiment. The study lasted for 40 years before anyone finally exposed it. In 1972, a journalist uncovered the shocking story and revealed it to the world. People everywhere were horrified when they learned what had happened. The experiment was finally shut down after the scandal became public. The Tuskegee study became one of the most infamous medical scandals in history. It forced the scientific community to rethink the ethics of human experimentation. But Tuskegee was only one example of terrifying experiments conducted in the name of science. People everywhere were horrified when they learned what had happened. The experiment was finally shut down after the scandal became public. The Tuskegee study became one of the most infamous medical scandals in history. It forced the scientific community to rethink the ethics of human experimentation. But the real experiments involved living human subjects who had been captured during the war. Prisoners brought to the facility had no idea they were about to become test subjects in dangerous experiments. Some experiments exposed people to deadly diseases like plague or cholera so researchers could study infections. Other tests exposed prisoners to extremely cold temperatures to study what happens when the body freezes. Scientists carefully recorded how quickly symptoms appeared and how the body reacted to infection. Researchers poured cold water over victims during winter conditions to observe the effects of severe frostbite. Doctors studied how frozen limbs changed over time while the prisoners suffered in the freezing temperatures. Some experiments tested how long the human body could survive extreme injuries during wartime conditions. Others focused on creating biological weapons capable of spreading deadly diseases across large populations. Entire teams of researchers worked inside the complex, believing their work would help win the war. For years, the secret laboratory continued operating while the outside world had no idea what was happening. Thousands of victims are believed to have suffered inside the walls of Unit 731. When the war finally ended, the secret facility was abandoned and its dark history slowly began emerging. Investigators eventually uncovered evidence showing how disturbing the experiments had truly been. Unit 731 is now remembered as one of the darkest and most terrifying experiments in history. But horrifying experiments were not limited to wartime laboratories, and some happened inside famous universities. In 1971, a psychology experiment at Stanford University would quickly become one of the most controversial studies ever conducted. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo wanted to study how ordinary people behave when placed in positions of authority and control. To conduct the experiment, researchers created a simulated prison inside the basement of the university building. Volunteers were randomly assigned roles as either prisoners or prison guards in the experiment. The participants were ordinary college students who had no history of violent or criminal behavior. At the beginning, everything seemed calm as the volunteers prepared to begin the psychological study. But once the experiment started, the atmosphere inside the simulated prison changed quickly. The students assigned as guards began acting far more aggressively than anyone expected. Some guards started enforcing strict rules and demanding complete obedience from the prisoners. Meanwhile, the prisoners began feeling powerless and trapped inside the simulated prison environment. Within only a short time, the participants started behaving as if the situation was completely real. Some guards began humiliating the prisoners and creating punishments for even minor rule violations. The psychological pressure quickly began affecting the mental state of the prisoners. Some participants became extremely distressed and showed clear signs of emotional breakdown. The experiment was originally planned to last for 2 full weeks. But the situation inside the simulated prison quickly spiraled out of control. Researchers began realizing the participants were taking their roles far too seriously. Some guards showed increasingly cruel behavior toward the prisoners. The prisoners began losing their sense of identity and personal control. The psychological stress inside the experiment grew stronger each day. After only 6 days, researchers decided the situation had become too dangerous to continue. The experiment was suddenly stopped long before the planned 2 weeks were finished. The results shocked psychologists and sparked serious debate about ethics in human experiments. The Stanford Prison Experiment became one of the most famous psychology studies ever conducted. It demonstrated how quickly power and authority can influence human behavior. But some experiments in history went even further by attempting to control the human mind itself. In 1920, psychologists conducted a famous experiment that would later become one of the most controversial studies in psychology. Researchers John Watson and Rosalie Rayner wanted to understand how human fears could be created through psychological conditioning. To test their theory, they selected a young infant who would later become known as Little Albert. At first, the child showed no fear when interacting with common animals and objects. Researchers began the experiment by introducing the child to a small white laboratory rat. The infant initially showed curiosity and even reached toward the animal without hesitation. Then the researchers introduced a sudden loud noise each time the child touched the rat. The loud noise frightened the infant and caused an immediate emotional reaction. Researchers repeated the pairing of the rat and the loud noise several times during the experiment. Eventually, the infant began showing fear even when the rat appeared without the noise. The researchers had successfully conditioned the child to associate the animal with fear. Even more surprising, the fear began spreading to other similar objects. The child showed fear when seeing rabbits, dogs, and even soft fur coats. The experiment demonstrated how easily emotional responses could be conditioned in humans. However, modern psychologists strongly criticize the study for serious ethical concerns. The child was never properly deconditioned from the fear created during the experiment. Today, the Little Albert study remains one of the most debated experiments in psychology history. But even stranger experiments would soon follow as scientists attempted to study human speech and intelligence. Today, the Little Albert study remains one of the most debated experiments in psychology history. But even stranger experiments would soon follow as scientists attempted to study human speech and intelligence. In 1939, a group of researchers conducted a disturbing experiment designed to study how speech disorders might develop in children. The study was led by a speech researcher named Wendell Johnson at the University of Iowa. Researchers believed that negative criticism might actually cause children to develop speech problems. To test this theory, the researchers selected children from a nearby orphanage. The children were divided into two different groups as part of the experiment. One group received encouragement and praise whenever they spoke during the study sessions. The second group experienced the opposite treatment and were constantly criticized for the way they spoke. Researchers repeatedly told these children that they were speaking incorrectly or developing speech problems. The second group experienced the opposite treatment and were constantly criticized for the way they spoke. Researchers repeatedly told these children that they were speaking incorrectly or developing speech problems. Over time, the constant criticism began affecting the children's confidence and willingness to speak. Some children became anxious and began avoiding speaking in front of others. The experiment showed how powerful psychological influence could be on developing behavior. However, the emotional impact on the children raised serious ethical concerns later. Many critics argued the experiment had harmed vulnerable participants who had trusted the researchers. The study later became known as the monster study because of the controversial methods used. Today, the experiment is often cited as an example of why strict research ethics are necessary. But some of the most shocking experiments in history were conducted on prisoners and hospital patients. After World War II, scientists began studying a powerful and dangerous force that had recently changed the world: nuclear radiation. Governments wanted to understand how radiation affected the human body in case of nuclear war. To gather this information, researchers began conducting experiments involving human subjects. Some of these studies took place in hospitals where patients were already receiving medical treatment. In certain cases, patients were exposed to radioactive materials without fully understanding the risks involved. Researchers wanted to measure how radiation spread through the body and affected different organs. Some experiments involved injecting radioactive substances so scientists could track how they moved through the bloodstream. Other tests measured how radiation affected bone tissue and internal organs over time. These studies were often justified as necessary research during the tense years of the Cold War. However, many critics later argued that some participants had never given informed consent. Years later, investigators uncovered records showing how widespread some of these radiation studies had been. The revelations shocked the public and raised serious questions about human experimentation. These cases eventually led to stronger rules designed to protect human research participants. But some of the most disturbing experiments ever performed were designed to push the limits of human endurance. Scientists have long wondered what would happen if a human being stayed awake for an extremely long period of time. Sleep is essential for the brain. But researchers wanted to understand the limits of human endurance. In several experiments, volunteers agreed to remain awake for as long as possible under close scientific observation. At first, the subjects simply felt tired. But their bodies quickly began showing unusual reactions. After many hours without sleep, concentration dropped and simple tasks became increasingly difficult. As the experiment continued, the volunteers began experiencing confusion and slow reaction times. Some participants reported seeing things that were not actually there. These hallucinations showed how strongly sleep deprivation could affect the human brain. Researchers carefully monitored the volunteers to ensure the experiments did not become dangerous. Despite the strange symptoms, the studies revealed important information about the role of sleep in brain function. These experiments helped scientists understand why sleep is critical for memory and mental stability. Today, sleep deprivation research continues. But strict ethical rules now protect participants. These terrifying experiments remind us how far scientists once pushed the limits of human testing. Throughout history, scientists have sometimes crossed dangerous ethical lines while trying to understand the limits of the human body and mind. Some experiments revealed important knowledge while others left behind dark stories that still disturb historians today. These studies remind us why modern science now follows strict ethical rules to protect human participants. Today, every responsible research project must receive approval from ethics committees before any experiment begins. But history still contains many unusual experiments that continue to fascinate scientists and curious readers. Understanding these stories helps us see how science has evolved over time. It also reminds us that curiosity must always be balanced with responsibility. Science can lead to incredible discoveries when used carefully and responsibly. But without ethical limits, even scientific curiosity can lead to dangerous consequences. If you enjoy exploring strange and mysterious stories from science and history, you are definitely in the right place. This channel explores the most unusual facts, discoveries, and mysteries from around the world. From bizarre historical events to incredible scientific discoveries, there are always more fascinating stories to uncover. If this video sparked your curiosity, consider subscribing so you never miss future discoveries. New videos explore strange facts, mysterious creatures, and unbelievable events hidden throughout history. And if you enjoyed this story, you might want to watch another surprising experiment from history. The next video reveals even stranger scientific ideas that once seemed impossible. So stay curious and keep exploring the strange side of science and history. Because the world is full of incredible stories waiting to be discovered. And sometimes the strangest stories are the ones that really happened. Thanks for watching and see you in the next discovery.